I have spent tens of thousands of hours across hundreds of games over more than 20 years of gaming. So I mean it when I say Death Stranding 2 is without question a true work of art and one of the best games I've ever played. While I have some nitpicks and minor complaints, as a whole I found it to be a genuinely unforgettable experience. However, having said that, I have to be honest and admit that I've had a difficult time figuring out what I want to say about it. That was until a couple of weeks ago when I stumbled upon an article that would have had me at a loss for words if such a thing were possible. In this article titled "The Women of Death Stranding 2 Are Stuck in a Sad Cycle," the author makes a lot of interesting points about the treatment of women in both Death Stranding and its sequel. And while I've tried my best to see where she's coming from, I ultimately feel that a lot of her points are rooted in a failure to correctly interpret the themes of Death Stranding as a series. And it's this frequent inability to grasp the meaning of these games that I want to talk about today. Now before I get ahead of myself, I want to make it perfectly clear that I'm painfully aware of the optics of this video. While I'm a staunch ally of women and queer people, I'm also a straight cis man about to criticize a woman's interpretation of how women are treated in a video game. And I hope that my being able to recognize the situation I'm putting myself in is at the very least enough reason for you to hear me out. I also want to make it perfectly clear that I have absolutely nothing against the author. I just think she's wrong about this. So if you're the kind of weirdo who just wants to see a woman get dunked on for internet points, please see yourself out. And with that out of the way, let's get on with the video. Also, before I forget, major spoiler warning for both Death Stranding 1 and 2. So then, let's just start at the top with the author's thesis. Maddie Myers writes, "In Death Stranding and Death Stranding 2, gender essentialism is load-bearing. You can't take it out of the games without the entire supernatural mythos caving in on itself. By gender essentialism, I mean that in these games, men are one way and women are another way. People are defined by these roles, and said roles are immutable, intuitive, destined. There is no spectrum in between." And at the core of her argument is the belief that, in Death Stranding, women, and again, it's only and specifically women, not trans men, not non-binary people who have ovaries, are inherently associated with the idea of the womb. Which she later reinforces by saying, "Unfortunately, all of it gets a bit more disturbing when put into the context of the way womanhood is reduced to being about motherhood, with motherhood being inherently linked to having a womb." So to clarify, the author is saying that the narratives of Death Stranding 1 and 2 are reliant on a conservative view of gender identity and sexuality that proposes women are only truly women so long as they have the ability to bear children, because womanhood is uniquely defined by having a womb. She does touch on some other topics that we'll get to later, but it seems to me at least that this is the author's larger point. And while I do think it'd be rather easy to counter that point on its own, I want to break down some of the evidence she provides to support this idea before getting to the bigger picture. So let's start with a statement the author makes near the beginning of the article. Quote, "The most important thing about women in the world of Death Stranding is their wombs. Unlike other science fiction representations of supernatural pregnancy, which often presented as a violation or horror visited upon its unwilling, often female, host, pregnancy in the world of Death Stranding is a universal good." Now, I think using the term supernatural pregnancy here, especially in the context of a violation or horror visited upon its unwilling host, is a bit strange. While I can't deny that pregnancy is inherently linked with the supernatural in Death Stranding, that doesn't take the form of any divine or eldritch conception like it would in something like Bloodborne. But that aside, what I really want to talk about here is this idea that the Death Stranding games present pregnancy as a universally good thing. Starting with Death Stranding 1, one of the more disturbing concepts presented to the player from the get-go, and the first meaningful reference to pregnancy, is that bridge babies, or BBs, can only be born to brain-dead women. I don't think it's reaching to say that this, if anything, intentionally gives the player a pretty grim perception of pregnancy in the world of Death Stranding very early on. And in what will be a trend throughout this video, I think one has to have a pretty strange interpretation of the game's story and setting to come away with the opposite impression. Moving along to Death Stranding 2, the grim reality of BBs and pregnancy is further reinforced by the fact that Neil is tormented by the immense guilt he feels for smuggling brain-dead women into the country. And it's heavily implied that the acting government, which is unquestionably depicted as sinister, was more than willing to make innocent women brain-dead if that's what it would take. Again, I think it's painfully clear that the player is meant to be uncomfortable, if not disturbed, when considering how pregnancy fits into the narrative of these games. But if that weren't enough, we still have to talk about Rainey. The author even mentions Rainey's pregnancy when talking about the way women are, quote, written with a life/death duality at their center. However, she fails to mention that Rainey's pregnancy is a source of great physical and emotional suffering for her. While the game doesn't emphasize the physical side of that too much, there's an entire scene in which she's taken to the doctor just to reassure her that her baby is actually alive. Because of course a woman who is stuck 7 months pregnant for an indeterminate amount of time is going to have moments of doubt and anxiety that would overwhelm most people. I don't really understand how someone could play through these games and come away with the idea that pregnancy is treated as a universal good, but to drive this point home even further, I have one final example. Sam's wife, Lucy. In the flashbacks to her and Neil's story, it's revealed that being pregnant with Sam's child is ultimately why she ended up dead, why she was going to be a science experiment, and why she was killed in an attempt to escape with her child to another country. Her pregnancy is at the heart of so much suffering that it eternally binds a dead man's soul to her unborn child. Again, I don't understand how you could possibly come away from either Death Stranding game, but especially the second one, with the belief that these games come anywhere close to presenting pregnancy as a universal good. I think you'd have a better time arguing the exact opposite, but I don't really believe that's the correct interpretation of things either. Now we have to talk about Fragile. In a section titled The Tragedy of Fragile, Myers writes, Fragile's story is one of the failed mother. She's presented as a child-free career woman for the duration of the first Death Stranding, although her lack of a child could be due to the torture she suffered at the hands of the game's over-the-top sadistic villain, Higgs. She continues, so beneath Fragile's pretty face, which was protected by the helmet, is a haggard old lady body. Can she still even have kids? Signs point to no, since timefall ages more than just the surface of someone's skin. It ages everything. We'll come back to this in a minute, because first I want to talk about this next section where the author says, Fragile's myopic goal throughout Death Stranding is to get revenge on Higgs. In theory, she's after him because he simply loves to kill people, but it's also clear she's out for personal revenge. Because of the way the plotline has been written, this unfortunately makes Fragile seem like a superficial person who wants revenge on Higgs for making her body old. There are plenty of reasons for Fragile and everyone else to despise Higgs and want to fight him. Giving this additional reasoning to Fragile is unnecessary and places undue importance on her physical appearance and beauty. Now, I think this makes it abundantly clear that the author has an inherently cynical interpretation of these games because this is such a misread of Fragile as a character, and it ignores core details of her motivations. While she obviously wants revenge on Higgs for torturing her, she's far more fixated on how he ruined her reputation and made her responsible for the deaths of thousands. Higgs abused her trust and used her name and credentials to deliver and detonate a nuclear bomb in the middle of a city. I personally believe the torture was more about demonstrating his sadism than giving her additional motivation for revenge. And I think this is reasonably supported by the fact that Higgs goes on to torture Sam in an even more sadistic fashion in Death Stranding 2. Anyway, circling back to the idea of Fragile as a failed mother, Myers goes on to say, so in Death Stranding 2, thanks to Rainey, Fragile is finally hot and young again. This means, of course, that she instantly needs to become a mother. A surrogate mother, but a mother nonetheless. And after explaining the circumstances surrounding Fragile and Lou's deaths, she makes the point that, having failed at motherhood, her life has no meaning. It's not even a life at all. She's eventually revealed to have been dead the entire time, after all. Now let's start with that comment about her becoming a surrogate mother. For starters, Fragile is hardly more than Lou's babysitter for a few days or weeks at most, and only takes on that role in order for Sam to take on a job she brings to him. I think it's really reaching to say that the short amount of time she spends with Lou at the beginning of the game is indicative of her nature as a surrogate mother. As for the point about her life having no meaning because she failed at being a mother, well, that completely ignores the explicitly stated goals of Fragile's remaining half, or Ha. If anything, the immense guilt she feels isn't the result of her failing as a mother, but rather for failing as a friend. She is, after all, attempting to give meaning to the time she has left by doing what she can to help Sam heal from the loss of Lou. The entire motivation for her journey in bringing Sam along is in part to help him recover. And it's only with her help that Sam and Lou do eventually reconnect. Because at the heart of Fragile's story is trust, not motherhood. Again, this just feels like another instance of the author completely missing the point. And speaking of missing the point, we finally get to talk about Higgs. In the second to last paragraph of this article, the author writes, "There's one male character who doesn't conform to Death Stranding's strict gender roles, and it's Higgs, the sadomasochistic villain whose unyielding desire to kill carries over from the first game to Death Stranding 2. She then says, His glam rock-inspired appearance makes him look cool as hell, but since he's a sadistic villain who kills Fragile and extensively tortures Sam, it's clear from the framework that I'm supposed to think that being androgynous is a bad thing. Alright, this is in my not-so-humble opinion the single most obvious indicator that the author has a rather poor understanding of representation. Now, if this were 40 years ago when something like The Little Mermaid came out, there might be some merit to this argument. However, we also live in a post-The Dark Knight world where it's fairly common for great villains to be deeply beloved characters and fan favorites. Characters like the Joker, Homelander from The Boys, and yeah, I'm including Higgs in there, are unrepentantly evil, and yet in many ways they are the face of their respective IPs. And even then, Higgs is a far more nuanced character than Superman with mommy issues and Brokeback Clownton. What I'm trying to get at is that Higgs is very intentionally written as one of the greatest villains of all time. Kojima loves this character, fans love this character, and the thing is, they loved him well before his more androgynous appearance in Death Stranding 2. I would argue that knowing how beloved Higgs is and has always been, the choice to make him present as stylistically queer or queer adjacent in the second game is nothing if not a positive representation of androgyny. And the fact that the author then says, quote, "Can't wait for Higgs cosplay folks, he has some great looks in this game," perfectly encapsulates the cognitive dissonance one must have to see this portrayal of Higgs as a bad thing. And furthermore, I just think it's absurd to imply that Higgs was given an androgynous style to suggest an underlying connection between androgyny and villainy. Which brings us neatly back around to the author's larger point regarding the relationship between the Death Stranding games and gender essentialism. I think I've made it pretty clear that these games do not present pregnancy as a universal good, motherhood as the defining characteristic of womanhood, or androgyny and queerness as things to be reviled. Those are the pillars upon which the argument presented by this article stands, and hopefully I've done a decent job taking them apart. But I don't know if all that was necessary to prove the author wrong, because at their core, the Death Stranding games in many ways present themselves as being anti-essentialism. Or as one commenter on Blue Sky put it, Sam Porter Bridges, the main character of Death Stranding, literally has a C-section scar and carries a baby in an artificial womb throughout the entire game until he essentially gives birth to it. And the idea that these games feature a conservative narrative based in gender essentialism really is patently absurd, especially when considering all the obvious evidence to the contrary, not to mention Kojima's very public support of women, queer people, and yaoi fan art. However, my reason for breaking down these arguments individually is to demonstrate that in a nutshell, these are the kinds of deeply flawed interpretations of Kojima's games common among professional and amateur critics alike, as well as to prove that this lack of media literacy isn't unique to out-of-touch tweets and grifting content creators. The only difference is that when faced with criticism of their own work, the professional critic might try to hide behind something like death of the author, whereas the grifter will just call you a shill. Ask me how I know. But what I'm getting at is that these kinds of arguments don't hold up in the face of the author's intent. They're based on speculative interpretations of minor details that conflict with the wider narrative and themes as already presented in definitive terms by the game itself. At best, they demand that the author be ignored, or at worst, they assign and project beliefs onto the author. And as such, they're the kind of arguments that a person can only make by fundamentally failing to understand art and the responsibilities of a critic. Or in other words, quote, "If you know about the art, then you have to know what the artist is doing. And if you know what the artist is doing, then you have to think about why, and you have to admit there are things you don't know. Understanding art means becoming curious, because now you're asking why did they do that? And the criticism can no longer be a vector to speak about yourself, but to get to know another person." Thanks for watching.